Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. Somewhat weirdly, book reviews are my favorite genre to write in. For those of us who like to write for the sake of it, book reviews give you kind of a pre-made hook, the book you're reviewing, to hang your ideas on. So you've already got a topic, now you just have to find an angle, and then you get to try to write it up with some style. Some months after the birth of my son a few years ago, I was struggling to begin my academic work again. And then an unexpected email landed in my inbox. It was from an editor at the online magazine Slate. Emily Wilson's Iliad was due to come out soon. Would I review it? So this one was a challenge. Capture Emily Wilson's work and my own take on it, and my own take on the Iliad and on Homer, all in 1,000 words or fewer. But I remember thinking that I could use this assignment as a railing to kind of hoist myself up and get back on my own feet again. Reading Wilson's Iliad with an eye to writing a review, and then writing the review itself, got the juices flowing again. Book reviewing, it's an art I don't think we think about enough. With book reviews, it's easy to go right for the substance and forget the style. But one of the reasons that I love them so much is because they challenge me both to think hard and to write well. And even as readerships for all sorts of print media decline, reviews remain really important. Maybe they're more important than ever. In a world where everyone's a critic, sometimes it pays to listen to the professional ones. As Daniel Mendelsohn, one of my favorite classics book reviewers, once wrote in an essay for The New Yorker titled A Critic's Manifesto, all criticism is based on the equation knowledge plus taste equals meaningful judgment. But he then goes right on to note that, quote, the key word here is meaningful. People who have strong reactions to a work, and most of us do, but don't possess the wider erudition that can give an opinion heft, are not critics. Mendelssohn, of course, has a point. Simply having an opinion does not a good critic make. And so one of the things we'll be discussing in this episode is a range of qualities that is on display in a good, and by good I mean meaningful, interesting, and worthwhile, critical book review, particularly one in the field of classics. My guests today are perhaps the two most prominent reviews editors in our field. They are Cliff Ando, who along with Camilla Mackay edits the Bryn Mawr Classical Review, and Mary Beard, who is, among very many other illustrious things, Classics Reviews editor at the Times Literary Supplement. Now, the BMCR and TLS might seem like very different publications, but during this episode, you'll be hearing how they've got more in common than you might expect. As these publications' editors, both Cliff and Mary do an enormous amount of service for the field of classics. Both, it so happens, have also written about reviewing, and I've put some references to those publications of theirs in the show notes for this episode. Clifford Ando teaches classics and history at the University of Chicago. His work focuses on the histories of law, religion, and government in the ancient world. He is the author, editor, and translator of some 20 books, and he has served as an editor, associate editor, or senior editor of Bryn Mawr Classical Review for not quite 20 years. Mary Beard is Professor Emerita of Classics at the University of Cambridge, a Fellow of Newnham College, and Professor of Ancient Literature at the Royal Academy. She's also the Classics editor of the Times Literary Supplement, a Fellow of the British Academy, and an international member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's the author of more than 20 books on the ancient world, and her latest one, Talking Classics, The Shock of the Old, is due out in spring 2026 with Profile Books in the UK and the University of Chicago Press in the US. Just a little reminder before we start that Lesche is on Instagram, where the handle is at Lesche Podcast. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Clifford Ando and Mary Beard. The next voice you'll be hearing is Mary's.
The TLS is in flux because it's just moved from being a weekly publication to being a bi-weekly publication. And that brings a whole lot of differences of kind of timescale and timetable. It seems so trivial, but we're still only getting used to it now. That said, I think of all the literary magazines, the TLS is still concerned, or at least I've been editor there since the 1990s for classics. I'm still concerned to give a quite a wide impression to a general reader of what's going on in the field. Now, it doesn't always come off, and I'm not sure that I succeed always in explaining Because what I'm doing is I'm explaining to the general reader. Most of the people who read the TLS are not going to buy the classics books. I mean, I think I think is probably quite different from some other review magazines. They're not going to buy the classics books, but they might buy occasionally, and they want to know what's going on in the field. So they are using the TLS, most of them, for kind of getting a sort of sense of where the field's at. And one of the things that I found most difficult is giving them a sense of where kind of new work on classics is going, particularly what kind of stuff is coming out of the United States, because they don't actually see that in their local bookshop very often. It's certainly not on the front table. And, I struggle with that a bit. I struggle with getting people who will review that for, an audience that isn't going to buy this kind of book. I think in generally, I feel pleased at what we do. And I think that we put out there some reviews of books that you'd never see reviewed in a Sunday newspaper, which I suppose in the UK is the comparison. I mean, you wouldn't get, thinking of you here, Johanna, you wouldn't get post-classicisms reviewed in the Sunday Times. You wouldn't get, sometimes I do text. We did something on Cicero's De Amicitia recently. No Latin text of the De Amicitia would get a look in the New Statesman. So we kind of fill that gap between here's your stocking filler book of everything you wanted to know about Roman arches for Christmas and the really technical. And I think we do all right. I think we could do better. I think that it's not always easy to find reviewers who want to fill that gap. Both of you two, quite different. But I am amazed that when I ask a new reviewer, 1 out of 3 times I get a review that comes in with footnotes. Have they never looked at the two? It is quite difficult to get people to loosen up and say, I try to say, you're talking to Margaret Drabble or Margaret Atwood, all the Margarets, right? Talk to them, not to your colleagues. But, we do our best. We're not like the London Review or the New York Review in that we don't always have long reviews. Now, that's sometimes annoying, but it also gives a bit of freedom. You can risk 800 words on something pretty niche.
And about how many classics reviews do you tend to publish?
I would have said, if I was going back to when we were weekly, I would have said that we would have had a classics page or 2 pages every other week. We haven't, I don't think, sustained that in the transition to bi-weekly, but I think we will get back to it. I think we're still kind of not quite knowing at the TLS how to manage the queues, and it squeezed some things out. It's made for bigger delays. But I reckon that if you beam down in a year's time, we will be back to having a page of classics reviews most issues.
So that's really interesting. I never thought of that about it, and it makes total sense. And I can see how important it is that at the TLS you're curating this glimpse at the field for outsiders. That's really interesting. But Cliff, at BMCR, you have a very different charge.
Yeah, so we do. I think so. The quick answer is I'll give you a quick answer and a slightly longer answer. The quick answer is that BMCR, Bryn Mawr Classical Review, I think conceives of its audience mostly as something like professional classicists and students of classics. I think we have a much wider audience than that, and I'll come to that in a moment. And we publish many more reviews than TLS. In fact, we publish more reviews than most. We publish, the number's gone down somewhat, but we publish between 500 and 600 reviews a year. It used to be slightly higher. And that number is greater, so far as I know, than any of the other big review journals in the profession. It's bigger than Latomus, it's bigger than HNet, it's bigger than Gnomon, it's bigger than American Journal of Archaeology, and so forth. But to speak about mission, let me just add a few quick words about the history of BMCR, because the place where BMCR now is not where we started, and it's kind of interesting to think about that. When BMCR launched, the ambition of its founders was to publish extraordinarily timely notices, more or less by email, very quickly. They thought you could say something about what made a book interesting, or perhaps not worth reading, in about 250 words within a few days of receipt of the book. And it would go out by email, and therefore it would be received, and it would only be archived or available to people to the extent that people saved it themselves. And in that sense, it was fascinating in its kind of ambitions about what it wished to convey to people, and about how it imagined its own ontology, or how it imagined itself as a resource. Something quite fundamental changed about BMCR's relationship to its audience, and for that matter, how its mission was conceived, when we acquired the earliest version of an archive, when, far from being an email that simply showed up and only showed up in your inbox, BMCR reviews became available for retrieval as a kind of map to the profession of its own publications. And we became very rapidly a kind of resource for people, not simply, rather curiously, to something like the literature, but perhaps also, frankly, to some wider public about the classical world. BMCR's website now receives, something sometimes as low as 11, but sometimes as many as 15 million hits a year. And that's not simply undergraduates writing term papers in classics. Rather curiously, despite the fact that our archive remains largely an archive of texts, only a few of which have images embedded in them, we are clearly a lot of people's, let us say, second go-to spot after Wikipedia if you Google, Julius Caesar Gaul. And that's an interesting place to be. It's not quite affected how we conceive of mission, but it clearly is on the mind of reviewers as they write. And I'll stop there, but there are other things I could say about history and audience that I think what we might get to as we go along.
My question is slightly different, or is this book going to be useful for what I want to know? And the BMCR will tell me whether it's going to, broadly, accurately tell me whether it's going to be useful.
Mary raises an excellent point, that I think BMCR's audience is something like instrumental readers. There are readers who are going to use publications to produce their own writing, or at least that's the, I think that's how reviewers think of it. And therefore, they need to provide a guide, not to the field, but to the book. Whether that's right or wrong, and whether the balance is always struck right, I don't know. And that's one of the reasons why, whatever we say in our guidelines, the quote-unquote BMCR review tends to include a chapter-by-chapter summary, because the reviewers themselves, the people who review for BMCR, themselves use BMCR reviews to figure out, do I need to read Beard on the Caesars? And if I want to use Beard on Caesars, which chapter is it that I want to look at?
It's interesting hearing you talk, because it's completely different from what I'm doing at the TLS. And, and it kind of helps me encapsulate, I think, a bit better what I'm doing, because, you've done BMCR for a very long time. As I said, I've done TLS since the early 1990s, I think. And I've come to see that my mission is to keep the ancient world on the horizon, on the agenda of the kind of people who read TLS. Now, that includes academics, but they are a minority of the readers. And so I'm thinking about not how can you show this subject off well, but I'm thinking of how can you show that there are really interesting debates still going on? For all those people who would say, oh, classics, that's a kind of dinosaur from, actually people are arguing about this stuff and it's interesting. And you as you say, Joanna, you can get a glimpse, you can get a little snapshot of what's going on. And that I suppose is why I'm very, very keen when I commission reviews, to make sure that the people will be able to speak to that general audience. But also, I have a kind of basic rule that I don't want to know what they're going to say in advance. So when people write in and say, "Oh, I wondered if you'd got a review commissioned for X, Y, and Z," because I think, "Oh, I know where you're coming from, sunshine." Sometimes I'm getting them wrong, and they're seriously interested. But one thing I can't afford to do, and I would not ever want to do, is make it look as if I was being sectional. I want to have all sections represented. I want to have some bluster, and I want to have some interest, and I want to have some surprise, and I want people to be able to say, "That's interesting. I didn't know that's what people were saying about Euripides now."
So, Mary, what do you look for in reviewers?
Somebody, I hope. I mean, the bottom line, and this is going to sound terribly dismissive, and I'm going to apologize now before everybody emails. I want somebody to be able to write for a general audience, which would include a specialist audience, which would get the general audience on board, but not patronize them. I don't want... Now, you may not remember that Julius Caesar was murdered in 44 BC. I don't want a Roman History 101. I want something that is incorporating and gives you a kind of place to stand to look at the book, but also at the debates in the subject that it somehow is opening up to you. And I think it's very hard, because academics are, I suppose we've always said this, and this is going to sound curmudgeonly and nostalgic, but there is a sense of a desire to so bolster what you say that you just succeed in saying piss off to everybody else. I'm compared to my colleagues on the TLS, I am kind of, sympathetic to, because I don't notice it as jargon, I suppose. I'm sympathetic to more in-group jargon. Everything on the TLS is read by two editors. It's read, when I commission something, it's read by me, and then it's read by a non-specialist editor, but often with a foot in the field. And, why do I get things sent back to me? Too much of the seminar room here, Mary. Kind of words like instantiate, and we could all name these words. Words that I use every day, but I'm afraid they look to our readers, young and old, and it's not an age gap. I think they look as if they're either being talked down to, or somehow they're just kind of getting academic ease. And I want someone who can be really, really clever and interesting, but keep me reading to the end.
Cliff, I think, one of the many differences between the TLS and the BMCR is I think that for many people in the field of classics, a BMCR review is their first publication. Graduate students are kind of supposed to check with their advisor first, which I don't think is a bad thing. What's the thinking? How does BMCR assign reviewers? I think people would appreciate some unveiling of that process.
BMCR essentially assigns books using two methods that operate more or less in sequence. Each month, we compile a list of books received, or in the modern world, books for which we've received a notification, since we no longer receive physical copies post-COVID. And we compile a list twice a month, so therefore about 30, 35 items per list, which is circulated internally to the editorial board, which is about 100 people long. And they have the opportunity to recommend reviewers to me. Of the two senior editors at BMCR, I'm the one who handles the assignments, broadly speaking. My colleague, Camilla Mackay, broadly speaking, is responsible for the editorial process. And then I read the recommendations of editors, and I approach and solicit reviews from people that the editorial board has identified as particularly qualified for this or that item.
Mary, do you ever look at that list when you're deciding which books the TLS should review? No, you don't. You don't look at that. I certainly look at that list for choosing podcast episodes. But
I mean,
it's a very useful list.
I know about it, and I think I should. The TLS, I suppose, has always been very reactive. And one of the things that Cliff just mentioned about how publishers are increasingly reluctant to send out hard copies has made me have to change my practice. Because what I used to do is I used to go into the TLS perhaps every week or perhaps every 10 days. I would lift the pile of books that had come in off my shelf. I'd sit down with them. I'd flick through them. I'd kind of think, I'd think them, and then try to send them out, try to get people to agree. You can't do that anymore because publishers are not sending. Or I have to say, if any publisher is listening to this and want a book reviewed in the TLS, can I suggest you send a hard copy? Because you're much more likely to get it reviewed if you do. Because, it does make a huge difference when you're kind of, particularly in my market, when you're judging what books you're going to review. It's partly the physicality of it. It's partly how it looks. It's partly what you feel when you open it, whether it's got footnotes that are halfway up the page or, what. All those things make a real difference. And it's you don't see it. You don't see the hard copy half as often as I would like to now.
The second process, which is, I think, largely what every now and then, of course, a member of the board will suggest a graduate student they know, but largely at that stage of the process, people are referring me to people who hold faculty positions as potential reviewers. And where relevant, I look at the website or the academia.edu page to make sure that it seems like a good fit. I have, at this point, having assigned somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 books for BMCR, I've probably looked at the online CV of something like every member of the profession. But then on the first of the month, or the first Monday of a month, BMCR releases the aggregate list of books received to our subscribers, which is just shy of 10,000 people. And they have an opportunity to volunteer to review the book via a website if it's not already been assigned. And they're invited to fill out the request form. Of course, they specify things like name and address, but we also ask them to identify their qualifications and any conflict of interest they might have. And at some point during the month, unfortunately, post-COVID and post the birth of my son Ezekiel, more likely towards the end of the month when the deadline is upon me, I review all the list of volunteers. I read their qualifications. I check out their websites if they sent it, and I make an assignment. And that process, ideally, if everything works out right, the list of books received goes to the subscribers only after I've made assignments from the earlier first process. Otherwise, we end up in the very awkward situation that I'm still negotiating with Beard when Johanna volunteers, and then I have to write to Johanna and say, I'm sorry, it wasn't actually available. It's in fact already been assigned.
How many of the books that you assign do you actually not receive a review copy? I mean, how many people actually deliver the reviews?
I used to know the statistics for that. We're very high. I can't remember, it's 70, 80%. But in let us say the industry, I should call what we do an industry. I don't know whether we're industrious, but we once looked at statistics in classics by writing to other editors of journals. And we compared this to a certain amount of publishing industry statistics on the return. And BMCR was dramatically higher than some other review journals. I mean, there are things like, I'm not going to remember, so I won't name, but, journals of the prestige of, say, classical philology or American historical review. But I'm not saying I remember their numbers, but quite prestigious journals would report receiving 20-25% of the reviews back. It was startling. I had no idea. I was upset that some of our reviews, that we don't receive reviews, and yet it turned out that we were, I hesitate to say it, but we were virtuous.
So, Mary, you're asking how many people turn in their homework, right? Yeah. What is it for the TLS?
I suppose it'd be about 70%. So I suppose that's good. Yeah. I mean, and people are not getting paid a lot, but they are getting paid. And like BMCR, it's coming out very quickly. I mean, that you're likely to, sometimes we have hiccups, but you're likely to see it in print within a couple of months. I am surprised, and I'm in a different position from Cliff, because I shouldn't have given the impression, if I did, that I never take volunteers, because sometimes you get a volunteer who's spot on and you don't sniff corruption and you think, great, and they turn in something great. But I'm trying to get people to review, and the refusal rate gets higher.
One thing I'll say about that links that I think helps to, I think the causes for the TLS's, frankly, high return rate are different than BMCR's. Publishing something in the TLS is, frankly, just more exciting for a scholar than publishing in, I don't know, a classical world. But
that's partly because your non-classical colleagues are likely to see it. So, you go into the faculty club and somebody says, "Oh, I saw your review in the TLS." And so there is a bit of a feel-good factor. I think that's true.
Well, I'm always very obsessive about turning them in on time for the TLS because I want to be asked back. I just feel so lucky to have been asked. I want to be asked back.
Don't worry, Joanna. Don't worry.
But with BMCR, another thing that distinguishes BMCR in a very kind of interesting and complicated way from, at least certainly used to distinguish from like all of its peers, is that we publish each review as its own email to subscribers. And as my very smart wife, Sarah Nutter, observed to me once, this makes the publication of a BMCR review an event, because it doesn't arrive in an email with 13 other reviews and you have to search, was it even in there? Did I make it in this issue? Am I in the next issue? Which, am I on page 872 or am I page 933, of a big journal like AHR? Each BMCR review appears on its own. And therefore, for both the author of the book and for the reviewer, you are joined together in a little tiny classics event. Everybody in the profession will see your names conjoined in their inbox in isolation from all other things. And that's part of, I think, that helps to explain the ongoing kind of centrality of BMCRs is frankly this very curious choice, which we have sustained in its way since foundation. I mean, I shouldn't say we, because I've been involved in BMCR just about 20 years, but it's in fact 35 years old.
Well, I think that's really interesting because it's helping me see or formulate that I'm thinking about the main function of the TLS differently, and I'm thinking about it as a conversation within broadly the arts and humanities, within a university-educated populace, but it's carving out a varied space for classics within that. Whether it is, and I've occasionally had to argue for this, what many of us, even me, might think is a rather dull catalogue of coinage from some Roman province, because I want to say this is what is still happening. Or whether, it is any of the kind of different and new and sometimes non-specialist, sometimes specialist approaches to reception or whatever. And I think it's a commercial publication. If people don't pick up the TLS, if they don't buy the TLS, it falls. And it's, however good the reviews are, when the audience survey comes in and people say, is there any section of the TLS you never read? If they all tick classics, then, I'm in trouble. And in a way, that little bit of the subject is in trouble. So I'm trying to do something a bit different. It's trying to be a critical showcase. Not an advert, but a critical showcase.
Well, something that Cliff was saying, it's interesting because they are such different publications, but I think that the TLS and BMCR, more than anything else, they are so visible throughout the field. And I think that when those reviews come out, not only is there attention, deservedly, primarily on the author of the book, but also, I think the reviewer gets a lot of response. I always get, you get emails if you write a BMCR review that comes out. You get emails if you write a TLS review. There's a lot of kind of exposure. Yeah, I think vulnerable exposure for the reviewer in both publications. And I guess I'm wondering how in both cases, because you also both allow for responses in ways that other publications don't do. So the TLS through the letters, and then Cliff, I know this is something that we've talked about in other circumstances before, some of the more famous back and forth. There are the responses, so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. So maybe, Mary, could you say a little bit about what is your view of kind of conversation about a review through letters?
I think, I'm conflicted on this. I think it's great to have a letters page in which people, authors, whatever, can respond and can take the argument on, right? That said, I feel uncomfortable when an author, young or old, doesn't really matter, has taken against a couple of sentences in a review in the TLS and then proceeds to produce, 1,000 words on why the reviewer got it wrong. And I think part of me thinks that it was really good critical analysis. Part of me thinks, just shut up, I think you're feeling terribly, terribly anxious about this. Take it up with Professor so-and-so, email him, have a discussion, thrash it out. I'm sure you're quite good friends, really. I would just say that you're quite pleased to have had a reasonably positive review in the TLS. Don't start to make a cause célèbre out of it. Now, as a staff member of the TLS, there's nothing we like more than a cause célèbre. No, but if it's a friend of mine who says, should I write in? I have to say, I confessed, and I hope nobody on the TLS is listening to this, because I'll get into trouble. I wouldn't really. Just write to him. Just write to him.
I feel a kind of similar hesitation about responses, but in the case of BMCR, it has to do in part with workload. BMCR is staffed almost entirely by volunteers, and neither of the senior editors, for example, Camilla Mackay because she's a librarian, and myself because at the University of, Chicago, they're not going to give me a teaching release for editing a review called, Bryn Mawr Classical Review. So, both at every single level, at the level of the senior editors, the associate editors, the members of the editorial board, we haven't got a lot of bandwidth to edit responses. And with responses, as with everything else we publish, we seek to have each item read by 3 persons prior to publication. And if you're publishing 550 reviews a year of 2,000 words, that's an awful lot of words that people have to digest. And the incremental addition of one response feels like a weighty burden. That said, so for some years when we had a comment function, we often, if somebody wrote and said, Cliff Ando is completely wrong. In the following, my book does do this. See, it's on page 172, note 19. Yeah. I would encourage them to append that to review as a comment on their own review. And I would urge that we try to publish responses when they take up issues that will be interest to the entire readership. And I pretended that what interests the entire readership is some great methodological claim about how to write a book or, how to do the profession. In actual fact, and here's where I turn towards Mary's response. The readership loves responses.
They get out those the popcorn munching memes.
Yeah, not only just readers of BMCR, but even the figures involved in these struggles themselves will confess, the response I had from Beard and my response to Beard, I got more email about that than I did about literally anything I've written in my entire life. And I was like, yes, you love it. The readership loves it. The only people who don't love it, frankly, is the editors who have to work on these documents.
Well, I think that this raises the question of, when there are back and forths over reviews, a lot of times they think that, those reviews will have originally perhaps, or, the responses will be more polemical, of the more polemical variety. And I'm wondering, Mary, because this is something that you have written about before, what is your take currently kind of on the appropriate tenor for reviews and sort of nastiness in, you could call it in reviewing? I know it's something that you have to deal with.
Yeah. Well, I also learnt the hard way, because I wrote my first review as a graduate student for the Journal of Roman Studies, and I will not name the book, but it was an extremely narrow graphical volume in German. And I said, what was the point? What was the point? Did we need, fantastic full-page plate of every fragment of these inscriptions? And I was, I was, a typical young woman in a hurry kind of stuff. About, I suppose, 3 months after this came out, I was in Rome where the author lived, and the author invited me to tea, knowing that I was in the city, and was so charming, so helpful, put me in touch with all kinds of people, and I went away. I never knew if he'd seen this review. I hope he had, because it would show that he was really weaponizing it. I thought, I would never have said that to his face. And I'm never, ever going to write a review again in which I would not say the criticisms to the person's face. Now, I have quite a wide bandwidth on that, and I also think, there's a kind of awful Scylla and Charybdis here, because there is just showing off. Showing off by being nasty is very tedious. But more what I now come across as a kind of review editor and commissioner is people who will never criticize. They will even say when they write back to say that they will do it, that of course I will only do this if I can write positively about the book. And at that point, I think, look, reviewing is it is a gatekeeping profession, actually. And the responsibility, the editor does have a responsibility to the author of the book, not to set them up, either with something that looks like a kind of a fixed job, or with something that looks like, a hatchet job ready to happen. And, I think I can say that I've never commissioned a review where I knew for certain what the reaction of the reviewer would be. Right? I think all that. But in the end, I think my responsibility is to the reader of the book, as much, if not more, as the writer of the book. And, I said that not many people reading the TLS are going to buy the book. That's true. Some of them might. And I don't want them to be seduced into buying a book that sounds good simply because the reviewer is determined not to give not just no offense, but almost no criticism. And I think, people actually, in the end, heaven's sake, for the sake of the planet, if nothing else, we've got to say, find some way of saying this wasn't a very good book. Otherwise, why review it? I suppose you can say, well, BMCR does its job because it's telling you what's in there. The TLS is a critical reviewer. Doesn't mean that you have to be pernicious and nasty. But I do expect somebody to say, hang on a minute, I'm not sure if this adds up, really. So, a diet of bland niceness is not just kind of, it doesn't in the end help anybody. It doesn't make anybody feel good. And I have to say that some of the best academic friendships I've been made have been when I have got in touch with or been in touch with people whom I have reviewed critically or who have reviewed me critically. And I'm sure that, Corey Brennan will not mind me saying that he wrote such a devastatingly bad review of a book I edited on priests in the ancient world that we got together and have been firm friends ever since. Criticism can be positive and interesting and bonding as much as it is destructive. Oh, and one woman wrote to me once and said, I know you didn't like my book, but I was so pleased that you had read it carefully. And we've since been friends too. And, so I think we ought to kind of get over this kind of sense of, was that a 4-star review or a 3-star review? It was an intervention in the field, which which you want to avow. You want to say, yeah, I did want to say that. Doesn't mean I hate Professor Ando.
I think Mary's got at the heart of a very difficult problem in this moment, which is the refusal of reviewers to say anything negative. If I could, I'd like to add two additional points to what Mary said. One is that we have tried in general to move in the direction. I think it's now, in fact, part of our guidelines for reviewers to the extent anyone looks at it. People writing book reviews should review the book and not the author. If the book is a problem, I mean, one way to encourage people not to make ad hominem books is to tell people, don't say this book is riddled with errors. It's because Cliff Ando is stupid. You could just say, no, the book is riddled with errors, and you could stop there if that's the case. So review the book, not the reviewer. And occasionally we reject reviews if people won't revise on these grounds alone. It's rare, but it happens. And since BMCR seeks to publish reviews of as much as possible, and since authors of books frequently ask, where is my BMCR review? We don't take that decision lightly. The second thing I'll say, which bears on something like the long history of reviewing in classics, and I think other related fields, is that there used to be all kinds of shorthands that people used in the field when they frankly didn't want to be straightforward about what they didn't like about a book. So you would find people saying things like, well, I read until page 17 and then I spotted an error in aspiration and I decided that, that Professor Lloyd Jones didn't really know Greek. And
Greek didn't have Greek.
I was recently, actually now that's some time ago, but some time ago I was in a meeting about rabbinic law, or you might say rabbinic literature. And somebody said about a colleague in the United States, so this was in Jerusalem, somebody, looking from Jerusalem to the United States said, well, Cliff, so-and-so doesn't really know Talmud. That's a load of crap. That means, I said, we have a shorthand like that in my profession in which people say so-and-so doesn't really know Greek. And I said, I don't think that's true. I think most of the people who get a PhD in classics actually know enough Greek to write their book and certainly could check before they published. And a typographical error is not the same thing as ignorance of language. And so really did know Talmud. I mean, I'm really sure that the person in question knew Talmud. What you in fact want to say, but are for whatever reason unwilling or perhaps even unable to say, is that you're having something like an aesthetic or moral reaction to a subfield. You don't think for example, you don't think so-and-so should be writing about gender at all. You don't think gender is an appropriate topic for serious scholarship. And your reaction is to somehow take the entire project and to set it aside by saying, implicitly, the kind of people who want to do X are the kind of people who shouldn't be in the profession because they don't really know Greek. And if people are going to say they don't like a book, they need to be honest about the causes of that. And they need to be precise. And I think the whole field is better off if people if people would engage in explicit discussions. There may in fact be methodological reasons to say, the motivating polarities of contemporary scholarship, the stuff we care about, frankly, is not the same as the stuff they care about. And we need to be cautious when we say the people at, topic A, topic B, topic C in the ancient world. This is a history of, even you continue to use gender. This is a history of gender in the ancient world. We, of course, need to be explicit in making any assertion or a history of sanitation in the ancient world, that their modes of understanding are different than ours. The stuff they cared about is different than ours, and so on. But to say that, to choose a topic that Mary is fond of, returning to sanitation, right? To say that we shouldn't be writing about, we shouldn't have monographs about toilets is somebody could say that. Well, first of all, then they wouldn't be the appropriate reviewer for the book. But it's also the case that, they should be honest about their objections.
I suppose where I would differ, not from what you think, but from what my reviewing practice is that in a couple of respects. One is that you say, and I totally understand this, I want the book review, not the author. I think there are some times in the TLS where I want the author reviewed. And, that often for a good reason. You have somebody who has been doing fantastic work for 30 years, totally under the radar of the ordinary people. And you want to say, look, this guy is just, this is his Gesammelte Schriften. And you've never heard of him, but my goodness me, he's brilliant, right? And this is what he spent a lifetime doing. And that's one of the ways of bringing the kind of achievements of academics into a more general readership. I mean, I suppose I also want to say that and this looks as if I'm going back on what I said before, and it's only partly going back. I think that if you have nothing good at all to say about the book, then it's probably not worth reviewing. And I suppose one of the things that I kind of think of now, when I read a hostile review, or when I write something which I kind of think is very critical, I do think, is there a sentence they can hoik out of that and think, she said this book will be really important for people working on whatever. No, is there something that means that it wasn't 100% bad? And I think that's kind of, that's politeness, and that is what you would do if you were talking to the person. If you were talking to the person about their work, you wouldn't. You'd start off with something nice, and so in that kind of conversation, can you find a way of a bit sugaring the pill? Otherwise, in the case of my readers, they say, well, if this book was complete rubbish, why am I reading a review of it?
Well, I wonder if there's something about things nowadays that incites people to equate critique with rudeness, because they don't have to be, shouldn't be, right, the same thing, that you can, launch a perfectly polite,
no, that's right,
rigorous
that's right.
critique of something. Right. And I think maybe, going back to, Cliff, things that you were saying about the, history of criticism in the field is that there is a history, particularly in classics, of critique being not very polite, that I wonder if this is something that we kind of need to, a skill set we need to hone collectively as a field, and
I think, Cliff has pointed to bad, some really kind of uncomfortable sides of, basically it was the old blokes, and they were just, firing off on all cylinders. Anybody who was going to get on their territory. There was also some kind of wonderful stuff. I mean, interestingly, I'm not sure if I'm remembering the reviewer right, but I think it was a review by Momigliano of Meggs's Trees and Timber in the Ancient World. And one of the early sentences was, this is a history of the ancient world written from the point of view of a tree. And suddenly, you needed to say no more, right? You had absolutely encapsulated all that was good and bad about Meggs's History of Ancient Timber. And, I think that the old guard have got things, there are some really nasty grudge matches that we want to avoid. Some, clever bits of irony that maybe we could, think about incorporating.
I should perhaps add that, of course, in many instances, despite having made these broad claims about principles, the application of the principle to any given case is always contingent. I mean, frankly, I would delight in a review that was actually funny, that was worth quoting. If there were sentences in a review that you would cut and paste and send to people, that would be lovely. If although I want authors, frankly, I want reviewers to write reviews of books and not authors. And therefore, for example, we don't especially pamper, or I don't want reviewers especially to pamper scholars who are pre-tenure. We're reviewing scholarship. Our utility to the profession depends on being honest. I have occasionally, including, say, in the last 10 years, a review will come in that is, just overwhelmingly negative and frankly not nice. It's not going to be received with pleasure by the author of the book. And, every now and then I think, well, since the cases that come to mind are mostly male, I will use the male pronoun. So-and-so is a big boy. This is somebody in their 50s or 60s with a big chair at a university. And frankly, if there's a negative review of their book, that's okay.
I mean, what I tend to do, and I don't know if you do this, is that I write back. I don't get those very often. But I do write back and say, I'm very happy to publish this, but just have another look, because I think that people could treat it, a bit too negatively. It could look as if you were gunning for the author. And sometimes, actually, people who've been kind of fired up about something say, oh, God, I didn't, now I've read it again, I think you're right. They don't always do that. So I think that you've got to give them a chance to escape hanging themselves, because the reviewer is hanging themselves as much as the author is being hung.
I think that's exactly right. We basically never publish anything without editing. So I shouldn't give the impression that a negative review comes in and we just say, so and so's a big boy and it just goes into print. I do think that people tend to, with BMCR, people tend to click, maybe elsewhere, people click send and submit the review as soon as it's done. And coming back to them after a few weeks of the editorial process, if you then say, are you sure? I know it'd be funny if you said this in seminar. It may not be so funny. And in particular, it may not be so funny after it's sat on our website for 7 years. Do you want people continuously returning to this thing? Is it, I don't think the answer is in these cases what they're doing is self-censoring, because I'm actually not entirely convinced, despite our free speech advocates nowadays at universities, I don't think self-censorship is that bad. If people look at their own prose and said, oh, I wasn't actually being helpful, I was just being rude at someone else's expense, and they want to revise, that's fine. So I think actually the sheer temporality of the editorial process is actually of assistance here, because among other things, people distance themselves from the book, and they also have the opportunity to think about the very, very, very long life of something that remains on the web forever.
I think also the difference, or another difference with something like the TLS and something like any kind of mainstream classical reviewing, is that I have to think about how the classical product fits into the wide range of stuff, whether it's on English or history or Asian history or the Middle East or whatever. And there are kind of, we've recently been through one of these. There are kind of strange surprises that, everybody gets fixated about Trump, is what, if they still are a bit, but a few months ago. So that every damn review that came in, whether it was of Jane Austen or, Roman bath buildings or whatever, had something about Trump, And so if you were a reader reading the paper, as we hope they'll do, which is not just going to the classic section, all you had was a series of essays which appeared to be about Trump. So I had to keep saying to people, now, I know that you could bring in the president into this review, because I can see how it can be relevant, but we have had a little problem here. And so you have to think about how, in my case, not just that the individual comes over, but how the paper comes over. And I can tell you, there were a few months when there wasn't a single review, almost, that came into the TLS without somehow finding a moral about the President of the United States. And God, it got, each one, a brilliant aperçu, but God, it got boring when you read it from start to finish. And, so we are, it's the absolute inverse of Cliff saying, look, there is a moment on BMCR when the review hits the inbox, right? There is no moment on the TLS. It's the paper. And it is then how it relates to a whole, which you're wanting to be a satisfying whole for everybody. It's very hard to, it's hard to do that, but it means that you're not, classics isn't independent.
Well, to wind down, I guess I would ask each of you, Mary, maybe I'll start with you. What's one thing that you wish that anyone who wrote a review for you knew, or, maybe a piece of advice or one thing that you wish that people would just be aware of?
I would say, could you read a few back numbers of the TLS and see what's kind of going on? I don't think that's essential, but I think that, as I said before, when people send you in, a lot of people send you in reviews with footnotes, you think, you have not looked at the paper. Now, okay, I don't send out a style guide. And I think that's quite a good idea, because actually we can do quite a lot of all the essential styling. But I want you to know, I want you to think, what makes a good review for this audience? And spend a little bit of time just reading through not just classics reviews, but reviews in a few issues, and you're thinking for yourself what worked. Read a review that is not in your specialist area, and see where you think some spoke to you and some didn't. So, just think of the readers, guys. Think of the readers.
Yes. Cliff, what do you think?
I'd say two things. First, both of which push back against what I've already said is widely known by all, including myself, about what the utility of the BMCR review is. I would enjoy a little more experimentation in terms of something like literary form. And I wish, if beyond something like, beyond an account of the book and then a critique of the book, in something like isolation, with the very occasional gesture to other literature, there's a way in which the chapter by chapter summary often seems to prevent people from thinking hard about the argument of the book as a whole and the meaning of that argument in the context of contemporary scholarship. And I'd like people to be more adventurous with the book review as a kind of intellectual endeavor in its own right, to engage, as long as we're reviewing books and not, say, chapters, review the argument. And I recognize that many people come to the BMCR with one thing in mind, but I think the BMCR reminds me a bit about sort of like my feelings about the contemporary New York Times op-ed page, where the kind of the rhetoric and the form of the things now are so immensely predictable. You were to ask yourself, what would happen if, say, the Times, as opposed to the Wall Street Journal, took on higher ed? Well, you would get something that looks like this and not that. And that's fine. It's vaguely comforting to encounter these reassuring voices saying reassuring things in the same reassuring manner as you've heard them before. But I also find that at some level, in the end, by the time you've read, maybe I read more BMCR reviews than many people, but you start to long for a little excitement. You want something jarring. You want somebody. You want, but among things you want somebody who takes on board the book as a whole, rather than the book as an aggregate of chapters.
And at some level, it should be fun doing it. You can really sniff out when someone has thought it has been really interesting engaging with this book, even if I don't agree with it. And it's, the sense of, there's got to be pleasure and enjoyment here, not just dutiful summary with a few critical points. You've got to say, for me, what difference has this book made? What difference?
And I think that's a place where, if you think about those BMCR reviews that do a little more than summarize, AI can do that nowadays, right? So, people should provide the insights that AI cannot, and the kind of contextualization and argumentation, I suppose. Well, in any case, thank you both so much for this conversation. I'm sure that listeners will be very, very interested in it. And thanks for all the work that you do as editors of these publications. So, thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Johanna.
Thanks, Johanna. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast. And special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.